Hi, fantasy readers. This is Karyne Norton, your fellow book binger, and you are listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. We are back after summer break, and it feels so good. As much as I enjoy the extra time with my kids, I also really enjoy a predictable schedule, and going back to school makes that possible. We're starting off Season 3 with a bang by featuring an epic fantasy story with deadly magic and swords from one of my favorite authors. And while I might be biased because she's been my critique partner for years, I still think it's fair to say she's a favorite for many of you as well. She's actually the first author I ever featured on Finding Fantasy Reads, which was immensely brave of her, because who really knew where this venture was going? I sure didn't. If you haven't guessed by now, the story is written by J.A. Andrews, author of The Keeper Chronicles. All her books take place in the same world, making sure you always know what you're getting from her stories, which is a setting with your classic elves and dwarves mixed with beautiful magic, deep characters, and themes of hope. I'll be narrating her story, which is a little longer, so you'll get part 1 this week and part 2 next week. Be sure to stick around to the end or check out today's show notes to see where you can find more from Janice, as well as how to enter our summer giveaway with fantastic audiobooks and an Audible subscription. For now, please enjoy The Shadowed Blade, Part 1 by J.A. Andrews. Chapter 1. Desolation hung over the moors in the feeble blue of the thin-stretched sky. Keeper Chesavia battled up the rise through the scrub brush as prickly leaves grabbed at her legs like grasping fingers. Impressions of trails offered easier passage just to her right or off to the left. But there were no trails to follow on the moors. Just the rumor that anchored into the vow she'd made long ago, pulling her relentlessly forward. Sunshine fell in a soothing shower of life-giving vital, as it did in other, more lively parts of the world. There was vital in anything that had its own energy, of course. The plants at her feet held their own subtle traces of it, but nothing compared to the sunlight. She held out her arms and drew a little into herself. It washed through her until her skin hummed with it. The ache in her legs faded, and her sluggish mind roused. She reached the top of the hill, and the moors rolled away in every direction, fading into blue-green haze on the horizon. The wind shoved at her back, tugging stray hairs out of her braid. Behind her, a blotch of darker green, the green of actual trees, was just visible far to the west. She would have been back in those trees days ago, her tasks in this part of the world long done, if she hadn't heard the rumor. Chesavia turned her sigh into a long, bracing exhale. To the southeast, a smudge of smoke rose at a sharp angle, driven by the wind. From this far away, there was no sign of the Tessari, the canvas tents that would be clustered beneath the smoke. It would take hours to reach the clan's encampment. If she made it by dusk, she'd be surprised. The thought of approaching the mountain without the sunlight set her feet to moving again. An errant eddy of fear escaped her control, and she drew in a long breath, counting heartbeats on the inhale and more on the exhale. Her vow had driven her to plenty of objectively dangerous places over the years, and there was no actual proof that this would be worse than those. It's not the violence of the storm, she thought, rubbing the rune tattooed above her wrist. The truth of it steadied her, and her apprehension quieted. The stories of Chief Naj of the Mountain Clan circled in her mind, varied and sensational. It wasn't only that he'd conquered 3 clans in the past half-year. Battles were endless on the moors. It was the troubling undercurrents to the stories that she couldn't quite discount. They said he had some dark power that lent him strength, that in a land where a man's status was displayed by the quality of his weapons, Naj was so fierce he used only crude common swords and was still unstoppable. They said that he fought like a man possessed, or, more often, that he really was possessed by a demon that he controlled through an enchanted cuff he wore on his arm. As a keeper, Chasavia had spent the last decade of her 28 years collecting and recording such stories. Normally, she'd take these with a fortifying skepticism, but somehow, here on the endless windswept moors, her mind kept circling back to them. It's not a demon, she told herself for the 10th time. It's a man with a dying son. I can endure some discomfort in the effort to fix that. Shifting the pack of healing herbs on her back, she strode forward. By the time she could make out individual tents, the sun sat low, its light barely tingling across the back of her neck. The air cooled with the coming evening, and she pulled on her black keeper's robe. In parts of the world that felt very far from here, it would gain a decent amount of attention. Even in the King's Council, it afforded her respect. Not from King Lennis, of course, but from most others. Here on the trackless moors, though, no one would recognize it. Which, all things considered, would be to her benefit. She topped the current rise, and the full size of the Montan encampment came into view. Unlike the usual small gathering of tents, ahead of her sprawled a massive collection of Tassari. Around them, children dressed in red and gold drove herds of goats and moor sheep and squat southern cattle into pens for the night. Chasavia's shadow stretched toward the encampment, and the dark alleys between the Tassari seemed to swallow it up. A shiver of fear trickled down her neck, and she fought the urge to back away and separate herself from it. She drew the evening sunlight into herself, funneling it down into her hands, storing it in the 4 roughly made rings on her fingers. Vital filled them, pressing against the hidden runes carved on the inside of each. Not a demon, she repeated, but even her internal voice sounded unconvinced. One of the sentries shouted, pointing at her. She took in the 6 men between her and the camp, searching for anything welcoming. Anything but naked hostility. I don't even need welcoming. After a week on the moors, I'd settle for anything as mild as suspicious curiosity. But by the time she reached the sentry line, 6 battle-scarred Montan warriors blocked her path, their postures and expressions openly hostile. She barely came up to their shoulders, and they gauged her like men assessing a breeding goat. She forced herself not to shift as their eyes trailed over her arms, looking for brands. So much for curiosity. She soaked in more sunlight, funneling it in streams of tingling warmth down to her hands. Perhaps everyone on the moors has a more mundane sort of demon, one that makes them hate everyone the slightest bit different from themselves. I come to see Chief Naj's son, she said, keeping her voice even. Their expressions darkened at the audacity of a woman addressing them. I heard he was wounded in battle. You're a healer? Asked the only one with streaks of gray in his long black hair. His southern accent caught on consonants. From Queensland, Chasavia answered, her black keeper's robe feeling like a beacon proclaiming her identity. The tallest man circled behind her, and she drew in more light until her palms hummed with it. Don't do this. Just extend a little trust, like normal, non-paranoid adults. You are a long way from home, the older man said. The hiss of a drawn sword sounded from behind her, and she couldn't stop a flinch of uneasiness this time, but it warred with a simmering irritation. I mean none of you harm. I have vowed to heal any I find in need, no matter how far from... Steel glinted as the tall man brought his sword around to her throat. and her untamed fear rose again. Chasavia grabbed his forearm and pushed Vital out of the tiny moon-shaped ring on her smallest finger. In a stream of lavender light, which none of the men gave any sign of seeing, it surged up his arm. It raced into his mind even as its warmth drove away her nerves. He grunted, then sagged against her. As he toppled to the side, she pulled the hilt of his sword out of his limp hand and held it out, point down. The other sentries drew their swords and spread out around her. She dropped the sword, holding up her hands. He's just asleep. Her ring was empty, and she poured a little more Vital into it from her hands, considering the remaining men. She could put one more of them to sleep if they attacked, maybe two, but not all of them. Her hammered ring would take the motivation out of another, leaving him aimless. Reluctantly, she focused on the bronze band on her thumb. Don't make me use this one, she thought. Her other rings would immobilize 3 of them. But if all 5 attacked? I'm only here to heal the chief's son, she said, trying to make them listen. Judging from what I've heard, I may be the only person on the moors who can. She met the gaze of the older man, whose expression had grown vicious. A little discomfort can be endured. When he didn't answer, she added, You might not want to harm me before you see if I'm telling the truth. If you're not speaking the truth, you will not survive long. He reached for her, then seemed to think better of it and motioned her toward the tents instead. 2 more fell in behind them, leaving the others to tend the man crumpled on the ground. They entered the cluster of tents, moving quickly through winding alleyways of fabric walls. The thick linen canvas shifted to a higher quality the farther they went. When they stepped into the open space that would be a town square in any permanent village, she stopped, staring at the extravagant sprawling tassar that filled the far side. Its fabric was woven in rich hues of scarlet and gold. Easily 10 times larger than any tent around it, it dominated the space like a king gracing the common folk with his presence. The sentry shoved the pommel of his sword into her back, and she stumbled forward, pulling the last of the dying sunlight into her before ducking in through the open flaps of the front entrance. The wind cut off abruptly as she stepped into a wide chamber draped with reds and oranges. A dozen hanging lanterns cast golden light against the crimson fabric walls. Thick animal hides covered the ground, and fur-covered seats lined the walls. The scent of roasting meat rose from a fire pit in the center of the room, mixing with a citrus smell from incense burning in the far corner. Though the incessant wind blew over the open chimney hole in the roof above it, the air inside the tassar was still, and the sheltering feel of it almost relaxed Chasavia's shoulders. Except the entire place was too unexpected. Brilliantly colored paintings and tapestries of battles hung on the walls, artwork that would be at home in a royal palace. But instead of uptight noblemen, 6 long-haired, wild-looking men stared at her from where they relaxed around the room. 5 of them were dressed in the rough leathers of warriors, but the 6th... The older sentry drove her to her knees. The Vital from the sunlight still thrummed in her hands, but she held it in. Naj tak. The sentry stepped up beside Chasavia with a bow. This woman claims to be a healer. She's too young to be a wise woman, a dark-haired warrior said from beside her. And too pretty to be a witch. The other warriors laughed. The 6th man did not. Chapter 2. The 6th man sat at the end of the room, lounging on a raised pile of furs, swirling dark red wine in a glass exquisite enough to be on the king's table in Queensland. His hair was slightly wild, hanging down his back in thick auburn braids. His temples were just beginning to gray, as was his beard along his chin. but there was no sign of frailty in his body or his expression. He appeared relaxed, but watched her with a shrewdness that showed she had his full attention. "Chief Naj," she said, "I have heard that your son Karyne is—" The dark-haired warrior lunged forward, his hand raised to backhand her. "You dare address the talk—" "Fran," Naj said quietly, raising a single gold-ringed finger. The warrior stopped, glaring at Chesavia. "Women do not speak unless told to." Chesavia met his gaze. "I am aware of your customs." "But you do not follow them." Naj rose and stalked toward her. "Would you remain silent in a land that expected men not to speak?" He stepped up close to her, a smile crossing his lips, taking in her wind-blown hair and keeper's robe. "I would not." He was dressed in black, the fabric well worn but well made. His vest held the elegant cut of a nobleman's armor rather than a nomadic warlord's. A line of gold buttons ran down the front of it, and a gold chain encircled his neck. In contrast, the two swords at his belt were blatantly common. Their hilts were rough, their length merely adequate. Except around the one on his right hip, Chesavia caught a glimmer of blue glowing from the blade. The other looked thoroughly plain. He set one finger under her chin and lifted it. Just a little discomfort, she thought, holding herself still. To banish the traitorous fear that rose in her again, she focused on him, taking the chance to study him just as closely. Instead of the square-jawed Gringonian look of the warriors around him, Naj's face was thinner, his brows arched in the exact sort of curiosity she'd been searching for. His eyes a dark, rich brown that studied her as though he could sort out the entire mystery of who she was with a single examination. Not what I'd expect a demon-possessed man to look like. He tilted her face to the side. "Coastal Balon?" She twitched her chin away from his finger, and the sentry behind her grabbed her shoulder, squeezing his fingers into it. "I'm from southern Queensland," she said, twisting under his grip, "very near the Balinese border." Naj took a step back, swirling his wine. "And you came all the way here, just to heal my son?" The sentry's grip dug into her shoulder. She set her hand on his, pouring enough vital into it to heat up his skin. He hissed, pulling back. "Witch!" Every warrior leapt to their feet, swords drawn. Naj narrowed his eyes. Chesavia focused again on the vital in the thick bronze ring on her thumb. Against this many men, even that might not be enough. The image of another room, long ago, with 4 men drained lifeless on the floor, and her thick ring glowing with a fierce violet light flashed into her mind. She blinked it away and held up her hands. "A healer, not a witch. My name is Chesavia, and yes, I'm here to heal your son. Reports put him very near to death." "She was sent to kill him," Fran said flatly. Chesavia turned to the man, working to keep the irritation out of her voice. Who would make such a stupid plan when merely waiting a little while would accomplish the same goal? Fran's face grew livid. "He will heal in time." Naj raised his finger again off his glass, and Fran bit off his words. "So you came," Naj said, "knowing the reception you would receive, just to help someone whom you've never met, and is of no personal value to you." "I have sworn an oath to heal any I hear of if I am able," she answered. "Every life holds personal value to me." "A pretty sentiment," Naj said, "from someone who perhaps has not seen enough of the world to know better." Chesavia held in a sigh. So, it's the mundane sort of demon, then. A witch with a stupid plan, Franz said, and a stupid sentiment. Naj's mouth twisted up in a smile. This stupidity will save your son's life, Chisavia said, if you're clever enough to accept it. His expression stayed mild, but his glass stopped swirling. You are, Chisavia continued, rumored to be a clever man. One of his fingers tapped his glass. What clever man would let a stranger near his son? In most parts of the world, she said, not bothering to hide her irritation this time, nearly any father would let a healer see their child. Here, I would imagine it's only the kind who has nothing left to lose. So, you assume I am desperate? Chisavia shrugged. I have no children, but I can imagine a circumstance like yours would give me a very great desperation. He considered her. I have yet to see proof that you are a healer. Chisavia caught sight of a bit of bandage at the edge of his sleeve. She cast out a wave of awareness, and her own body lit up as the vital that filled all living things and imbued all magic brightened in a way only she could see. The rings on her fingers glowed like smoldering coals with their stored power. It spread out from her, and her sense of the men behind her shifted into pillars of fire. No one in the tent gave any sign of noticing. She ignored the brightness of the men and the dim glow from a potted tree in the corner, and concentrated on Naj's arm. A short, deep cut flared up where his body was exerting extra energy to heal. I could heal. The swords at Naj's waist burst into light, glowing like they'd just been pulled from the forge. Chisavia stared at them. Vital. The swords held power. A lot of power. She raised her eyes to his, meeting a look that was tightening in suspicion. There was no demon. It wasn't even the man who had unnatural powers. It was his swords. She wiped the surprise off her face as her wave faded and the tent settled back into normalcy. I could heal that cut on your arm as proof. And how would you do that? With a bandage. She motioned to her pack, and some runes to focus the healing power. He straightened. You read runes? Chisavia paused at the intensity burning off of him. I do. The chief handed his glass to Fran. Then, with a smooth motion, Naj drew both swords. Impossibly fast, he held them crossed in front of her, their tips hovering like open scissors poised a handbreadth on either side of her neck. Fear surged up Chisavia's throat, choking her breath, and not just from the proximity of the steel. The swords blazed with power. One flashed with a brilliant blue light that swathed the entire blade, slithering in restless coils. The second sword was wreathed in black. Tendrils of inky shadows crawled along it with a hungry, grasping need. Even from a handbreadth away, it pulled at her vital, leaving the side of her neck aching with cold. Based on the casual amusement of the men around her, none of them could see the light or the shadows. Prove it, Naj said, still keeping his expression calm. Read. The blades were as rough as the hilts, shockingly crude for any man on the moors to carry, never mind a warlord. The lantern light wavered along the irregular steel and caught on large runes carved into them near her face. The carving itself was rough-hewn and barely legible. Chisavia shifted to see better, but Naj gave a sharp shake of his head. Do not touch, he commanded. I wouldn't dream of it, she said, honestly. The men in the tent surrounded them, watching with an unnerving bloodlust. This one, she nodded ever so slightly at the blue sword, says Svard Naj, or Sword of Naj, in a more modern tongue. And this, she took in the runes on the black blade, wanting nothing more than to pull back from the cold, hungry shadows. This one says swift death. As your death will be, Naj said, if you try anything dishonest. He drew back and sheathed his swords. A wholesomely warm wash of air replaced the chill at her neck. The chief pulled up his sleeve and tore off a bandage, revealing the narrow cut. Heal it. Despite his casual tone, there was a greediness in his posture. Najtak, the sentry behind her warned. She put Roll to sleep with just a touch. You can do that without runes? Naj asked her. Chasavia paused, not looking at her rings. To cause someone to sleep requires a broad brush. Healing a specific wound requires more precision. The explanation was true enough. There was no need to tell him that without the runes, any healing would be so inefficient that she'd exhaust herself before healing even this small cut. So you are not the sort of healer who can merely lay hands on someone and heal them? Naj kept his face calm, but his eyes were probing. I know a few of those, but if you wait for one, you may not have a son for them to lay their hands on. Not that they would have come this far for a wound they weren't strong enough to heal. She pulled her pack off her back and drew a bandage out of one of the pockets. You'd rather have me, Chief Naj, if I may speak bluntly. He let out an amused breath. It seems you always do. Leaning closer, he gestured to the bandage. I see no runes. I haven't written them yet. She set the square of cloth against his wound and pressed her palm onto it. Casting out in a very narrow wave, ignoring the way his swords flared up again, she mapped out the shape and depth of his wound. Running her finger over the bandage, she poured a trickle of vital onto it, tracing out the simple lines of a connection rune, anchoring it to the wound. It appeared on the bandage in thin, seared lines. She added the far more complicated healing rune, drawing any vital outside the bandage into the wound itself, bolstering the body's healing. Naj watched the progress shrewdly. Chasavia finished the rune and cast out. The symbol lit with a glimmer of light. It's ready. Funneling out some of the vital she'd stored from the sun, she fed it into him in a stream of violet light, feeling it surge in around the wound and augment the work his body was doing. Deep in the lesion, the flesh grew back together, moving quickly up toward the surface, pressing out blood ahead of it until the skin on the surface smoothed out in a new, fresh layer. She pulled the bandage off, the runes now spotted with blood. Naj ran his fingers over his skin, where only the faintest trace of a scar remained. The entire room was silent for a long moment as his men craned to see. Naj took the bandage from her hand. Can this be used again? He asked quietly. No, it was specific to that wound. He gave it back to her, his expression unreadable. He rubbed his hand over his mouth, appraising her. That's a valuable skill, he said slowly, which undoubtedly makes you a valuable person where you are from. Chasavia held back a breath of laughter. That depends on who you ask. He considered her words. You know the ways of the clans. Why risk everything to come here? Because worthy goals often require enduring discomfort. She kept herself from gesturing to the still suspicious faces around her, and require a great deal of patience. I'm not a fan of patience, he said. I believe goals should be pursued and seized at the earliest opportunity. He shifted his weight, smooth and controlled, like a wildcat examining his prey. Chasavia bit back the first response that came to her mind and merely said, Perhaps that is the difference between a warlord and a healer. He gave her a small smile. Perhaps. He took his glass up again. Bring her to my son. Fetch Rennis to serve her. Chisavia rose to her feet. The chief returned to his seat and sank into his cushions, still studying her. But keep an eye on her. Chapter 3. Chisavia peeled a pus-encrusted cloth away from the gaping spear wound in Karyne's gut. The rune on it flickered out, and the putrid scent of infection wafted up as she dropped the used bandage on top of a handful of others. In the sick room, tucked in one corner of Naj's expansive tent, the young man lay senseless on the low bed, finally still from the sleeping draught she'd given him. He was 20 years old, with enough scars to show how his life on the moors had been spent. She held in a sigh at so many lives wasted in endless skirmishes and battles. Another cloth? Rennis asked with the same curtness she'd held for the past 2 hours. The very pregnant young woman had appeared while Chisavia was still assessing Karyne's wound. Rennis had assisted with a cold efficiency, offering new bandages, keeping braziers burning, and helping clean the wound with a competent proficiency. She leaned over the table of healing supplies, her swollen belly rubbing against it. No. Chisavia knelt next to the sickbed. Her hands ached from 2 hours of creating runes and pressing vital into them. The young man's wound was deep and messy. Infection raged through it and spread into his body. She'd corralled some of it, but there was so much more. He needs to rest, and so do I. Tomorrow we'll continue. When there's sunlight to tap into instead of merely the vital of a few fires. Rennis looked at the wound. You did nothing. The deepest parts must be healed before the surface. There was a cut in his bowel, spilling foulness out into the rest of his body. That is healed, and some space around it cleaned. You healed his bowel? Rennis said. Without touching it? I touched it, just not with my hands. Chisavia rose and held up a green bottle. At midnight, we'll give him 4 drops of this. It will keep him asleep until morning. We'll work again at dawn. The young woman took the bottle. You made this? Chisavia tamped down her exasperation at the endless suspicion. It won't harm him. Just keep him asleep. Rennis glanced toward the entrance of the tent, then lowered her voice. Where did you learn to do this? Chisavia's annoyance faded at the curiosity in the woman's voice. From some very wise men who recognized my talent and weren't afraid to teach a woman to do a great many things. Rennis kept her eyes on the bottle. Chisavia set her hand on the young woman's. You're good at this. I've appreciated your help. Pulling her hand away, Rennis moved to Karyne's side. There are a lot of wounds to treat here. Chisavia began cleaning her scalpels. Have you ever been off of the moors? Rennis shook her head. My father is chief of the Relman clan. I lived with them until Naj took me as his wife. Chisavia twisted to look at her. The young woman was barely older than Karyne. You're his wife? His 11th wife, Rennis explained. Karyne is the son of his first, and is Najtok's oldest son. 11th wife. Chisavia tried to keep the distaste off her face. He must trust your skills if he has you care for his son. The first smile Chisavia had seen turned up the edges of Rennis's mouth. He trusts my skills enough to watch you. No one here has skills to heal a wound such as this. She paused. Do you? Chisavia tucked the last of her scalpels back into her pack. He is very weak, she admitted, which is a huge understatement. The damage in his gut was extensive, and more tissue than she'd like to think about had already died. Tomorrow will tell us more. She rolled her neck to banish the ache across her shoulders. May I sleep in here with him? I'd like to keep an eye on... The tall, dark shape of Fran strode into the room. "Come," he ordered. Chisavia stopped in the act of buckling her pack. "Where?" Anger flashed across his face at the question, and he pointed out the door. "The talk commands you to dine with him, in his chambers." Rennis twitched at the last words, but kept her attention on the bandage she was cleaning. Chisavia rubbed at her face. Daring to speak to the chief in his hall was one thing. Declining a personal invitation was a different matter. And dinner would be a way to get a better feel of the notorious man. Of course, trying to remain polite when she was this tired would be a great challenge. But she was hungry. She dropped her hands. "I'd be honored." Chisavia followed his huge back out of the sick room and through another chamber before they came into the large hall where she'd met Naj earlier. It was odd to call part of a tent a hall, but it was the best word for the place. Fran led her across the space, through a room stacked with crates, and to another doorway draped in fabric. "You are to stay here." He lifted the fabric and pushed her shoulder forward. Chisavia stepped inside and stopped. If the entrance hall had been lavish, this room was palatial. The floor beneath her feet was thick with furs, the walls draped with rich red cloth woven with strands of gold. A massive bed of pillows was raised against the far wall, but this was much more than a bedchamber. A fire burned in a pit beneath an open patch of canvas. To her right, a large low table filled the space. Behind it was a set of shelves hanging from the ceiling on thick ropes. And every shelf held books. Books on the illiterate Moors. She stepped across the room to it, stunned. There were Balinese treaties on warfare, Napanese writings on economics, even histories from southern Queensland. She picked up one that discussed the strife between Queensland's southern duchy of Marshwell and coastal Balon, finding a reference to the treaty Tompkin of Marshwell had brokered a score of years ago. "Who are you?" Naj's voice cut quietly through the room. She spun to find him standing just inside the door, arms crossed. He'd removed the long tunic he'd worn earlier from under his vest, leaving his bare, battle-hardened arms exposed. "The common people of Queensland are no more educated than the commoners of Gringon. Yet you heal. You read." His gaze burned into her as though waiting for her to look away. She relaxed the grip she held on the book and met his eyes. "You're a woman who doesn't back down in a room of my best warriors, and you stand up to a warlord." His expression turned calculating. "You're used to standing up to powerful men, and clearly haven't been punished for it." King Lennis's contemptuous face rose to her mind as he spouted paranoia and petty accusations at her and all his advisors, the topic changing with his mood, or the weather, or perhaps the phases of the moon. "How about a bargain?" she said. "I'll answer questions about my life if you answer questions about yours." She held up the book. "For instance, how does a warlord on the moors come to own a library?" He unbuckled his sword belt and laid it on the table. The moment the blades came near each other, tendrils of blue light and black shadows snuck out of the top of their sheaths. He crossed his arms again, showing a leather bracer with a wide silver cuff on his left forearm. Runes were engraved into the metal in an elaborate pattern, surrounded by angular shapes that could be swords. She stepped closer to the table and made out a few of the symbols. "And that is not a cuff that controls a demon as your enemies believe. That looks like the mark of a Napanese trading company." A smile quirked up the side of his mouth. "I have no control over what my enemies say about me. This is the crest of a family I left behind to pursue something more meaningful." Two women entered the room, their eyes downcast, their steps quiet and unobtrusive as they carried 2 plates of steaming food. The scent of roasted venison and spices filled the chamber, and Naj gestured for her to sit. She took the cushion closest to her, placing the book to the side. That smells more delicious than it has any right to. One of the women came to her shoulder and set a plate down in front of her. It held a cut of roasted meat dripping with a rich, creamy sauce, some sort of spiced root vegetable, and a slice of bread slathered with goat butter. Thank you. The woman's eyes flickered up to her face, torn between surprise and something like wariness, but she gave a slight nod and hurried out of the room. Another woman brought in a bottle of wine and 2 of Naj's elegant glasses. Chasavia picked up the bottle, reading the label. Napanese wine? Behind the writing, a faint set of symbols was drawn into the background of the label. She gestured toward his cuff. Ah, your family's wine. A downside of growing up in a family of wine merchants is that it ruins your taste for things like the watery fruit wine that they serve on the moors. So you take trips home to get more? His smile widened. Something like that. He took the bottle and poured them each a glass, offering her one. The gold rings on his fingers caught the lantern light, and she was reminded again of the wealthy nobleman at court. She reached forward, and her sleeve slid up as she took it, revealing the very edge of a tattooed symbol. He let go of the glass, but took hold of her wrist, pushing her sleeve higher up, revealing the runes marked into her skin in sweeping, flowing lines. What is that? He rubbed his thumb over the tattoo as though it might rub off. Does it help you heal? No. His grip was secure around her wrist, not tight enough to hurt, but unwavering in its strength. She forced herself not to pull away. It helps me see the world the right way. What does it say? You can't read it? He shook his head. I know very few runes. Yet you carved some into your swords. He kept a relaxed grip on her wrist, but something about him tensed. My workmen tried to. The steel is difficult to work with. But you didn't answer me. What does this say? She took a breath, trying to focus on the words herself. The day is shaped not by the violence of the storm, but by the fall of the light and the voice of the rain. She waited for the question that always followed her reading of the runes. He merely held her wrist for a moment more, then released it, keeping his eyes on the tattoo as she pulled her hand back. I'm partial to the storm. Storms are ferocious and destructive, but then they pass. Rain and light bring life to the entire world. What is the power of a storm to that? He settled back to his side of the table and grinned. You haven't seen my storms. He lifted his glass. To a more interesting conversation than I expected tonight. To unexpected people, Chasavia countered. He took a sip, watching expectantly for her to do the same. She did, and the wine was excellent. Yet another aspect of this nomadic warlord's lifestyle that would fit effortlessly into the palace in Queenstown. It's very good, she said, and I am very interested to hear why a young man left an undoubtedly prosperous vineyard and his wealthy family to come here. He set his glass down and turned to his plate. Life rarely lets you choose your own path. That's true for many people, like your serving maids or your 11th wife. But clever sons of wealthy families usually choose their own paths. He leaned forward. Did you choose yours? Chasavia cut a slice of venison. No, she hadn't chosen. When she was 12, her affinity for Vital had appeared, and her training as a keeper since then had been rather neatly laid out for her. My skills chose my path for me. Perhaps mine did too. The meat was tender and flavorful, and she forced herself to eat slowly instead of shoving it down as fast as she could. Your fighting skills? Your enemies say you are unstoppable in battle. She glanced at the swords sitting on the end of the table, well within Naj's reach. There's an interesting story there. You're a feared warrior, yet every man on the moors carries a better sword than you. He picked up a piece of meat and pointed his fork at her. It's not the swords that make the man. His demeanor was still casual, his body relaxed, but there was something about him that had grown more tense. She paused, another bite half raised to her mouth. I think sometimes it is. His face split into another grin. Or maybe it's the demon he holds inside. Chesavia shrugged, picking up a vegetable. Perhaps. Many men have demons. And women? The root was crisp but tangy. And women. What is your demon? He asked, studying her again. She waved her fork at the tent around them. Putting myself in dangerous situations because I think the outcome is worth it. He gave a laugh. Perhaps we're more alike than I thought. I tend to walk into danger in pursuit of valuable things as well. He looked her over. Also, I think you come from wealth just as much as I do. Yet the rings on your fingers are cheap and crude. He pointed to her smallest finger. What is that supposed to be? A boat? She held up her hand, showing the awkwardly shaped ring. A crescent moon. It was made for me by a very young jeweler. Naj raised an eyebrow. Had he ever seen the moon? She laughed. Seeing as he'd spent his whole life in a crowded city where torches were always lit, he'd probably never seen it well. You must be fond of him to have kept it. Do you see this young jeweler often? Chesavia adjusted the ring, feeling the hum of the rune etched in the back. I haven't seen him in years, and while I am a little fond of him, I think I kept this because I am very fond of the moon. I prefer the sun. It is fire and power and life. Are you one of those who believes the moon has magical feminine powers? There was the slightest hint of mockery in his voice, but it was nearly cancelled out by some genuine curiosity. I think any magic the moon has is the common sort that is shared with everybody. Beauty and solace and hope. I do like that about her, but mainly I love her because I'd like to be more like her. A smile curled up his mouth. Cold and alone? Chesavia laughed again. She is that, but she also calms me in a way little else does. She tilted her roughly made ring to catch the lantern light. Her unruffled progress through the sky reminds me that if I could lift myself out of the messiness of this world, there is order and beauty and steadiness. The sun still burns. The earth still turns. Some grand scheme is still progressing. She's scarred and broken and only a single sphere in a vast sky, but when the sunlight hits her, I don't see her scars. I only see light that has transformed a dull thing and used it to breathe beauty into the whole world. She looked up and found Naj watching her with a burning intensity. I wish I were still young enough, he said, a hint of nostalgia in his voice, to so effortlessly see the good in things. Chesavia let out a breath that was half laugh, half disbelief. Effortless? I know of few things that require more effort than searching out the good in a world of suffering and frustration. He considered her words. Where exactly in Queensland do you live? Chesavia paused. I spend most of my time traveling, actually. Healing? Among other things, she admitted. Where do you call home? The place I've spent the most time lately is Queenstown. The answer was true enough. The palace had never felt anything like home, but it had been years since she'd been able to spend time at the only place that ever had. And she wasn't about to mention the keeper stronghold in a land where valuable people were seen as a commodity to be controlled and bartered. Nobility went missing on the moors and were ransomed for exorbitant prices, or never seen again. Who knew what would happen to a keeper? My turn. What meaningful thing did you come to the moors to pursue? Naj chewed his meat before answering. I like the freedom of it. But not enough to live in peace with your neighbors? Or are the rumors of the aggression of the Montan clan exaggerated? The world wants no one to be free. He took a sip of wine. You have to fight every day for it. And you must strike your enemy before he strikes you, if you want to survive. He smiled slightly at her raised eyebrow. You do not agree? I push for peace whenever I can, she answered. There are times when fighting is unavoidable, but I believe it should be a last resort. And I believe waiting until your enemy attacks is the sign of an irresponsible leader. It puts those you love in unnecessary danger. A mindset that has locked the Moors in war and death for the past century. She bit back the comment and changed the subject, gesturing to the swords. Those don't look Napanese any more than they look Gringonian. Where did you get them? I found them in a shipwreck. Naj ran his finger over the hilt of the black blade, and Chisavia felt a gnawing hunger lick out of the sword. I was 18 years old when my two friends and I discovered a merchant ship that had foundered on a rocky shoal. There were all sorts of interesting things on it, among them these. His hand moved to grip the hilt, and thin tentacles of shadow reached out for him. A hum started so low she could barely hear it, drawing her closer, reeling her in like a fish caught in a line, promising glory and power and victory. She drew back from it. What does that blade do? A general sense of the answer was obvious enough. How long after that did you use them for the first time? She asked quietly. He kept his grip on the sword. Brigands accosted us on our way home that very day. Tried to rob us. His voice lost all of its warmth, and an unnerving possessiveness crept into his eyes. Which is when I learned that you don't need fancy swords to protect yourself. She paused, fearing she knew the answer to this question as well. Did anyone survive? A strange look crossed his face, almost like guilt before it shifted to viciousness. The filthy bandits killed my friends before I could stop them. The fingers of shadow slid up his hand, sliding across his skin like snakes. Chisavia rubbed her own hand, trying to banish the way the sword called to her. He glanced up, and she dragged her eyes away from the sword, but he caught her expression, and his gaze turned suspicious. Why are you here? He demanded. To heal your son, she said honestly, and now maybe to do something about those swords. When he is healed, he asked slowly, releasing his grip, but leaving his fingertips resting on the hilt. Will you leave? The possessiveness still hung around his gaze, but instead of being focused on the swords, he turned the same look on her. A cold fear crawled up the back of her neck. Will you allow me to go? He slid his hand off the hilt and returned to his dinner. If you still desire it by then. Chapter 4. Evening sun slanted in the new doorway of Karyne's chamber. Naj had agreed to Chisavia's request for sunlight and fresh air in the room, and early this morning 2 workmen had created an entrance in time for her to catch the first rays of dawn that seeped into the sky. Now the reddening light of the ending day landed in a thin line behind her, warming the pelts covering the ground and obeying Chesavia's call to bend up and soak into her back. She knelt and pressed her hands to the rune-marked bandage over Karyne's wound. A haze of purple light glowed around it, even as her palms burned. She closed her eyes as she traced the progress moving slowly toward the surface. The young man was healing well. Maybe one more day of watching and helping and keeping him asleep before she'd wake him and assess how he felt. That should get him to the place where his own people could care for him. Then she could leave, head back to civilized places. The final stretch of dead tissue sloughed off in front of the swell of Vital. It was black and lifeless, and her mind strayed back again to Naj's sword. It was death that clung to the black one. There was no question about it. But how? It held a hunger to be wielded, and she toyed again with the morbid ideas of what it must do when Naj used it in battle. The fear that had plagued her all night surfaced. What happens when someone who knows how to wield Vital discovers the swords? I should just leave them here and go home. Tell someone else about them. The words sounded more like a wish than a plan. The final jagged edges of Karyne's last internal tear drew together, and Chesavia sank back onto her heels, probing the wound with her mind. The weariness that had been growing for the last several hours dragged down her shoulders. Sunlight landed only a few paces behind her, and she pulled it into herself, not for the young man, but to drive back her own exhaustion. I could just go lie in it. Her skin ached to feel the direct light, but she concentrated on the wound again. Just a little more work. A little more stinging of palms as the Vital flowed through her, a little more ache in her back from bending over, and she'd have accomplished everything she'd hoped for the day. The relentless wind of the moors had died off during the day, and the sheltered chamber was stuffy and warm. Rennis had removed her long-sleeved tunic and worked in a loose vest that billowed out over her belly. Can you help the burn? Near the open spear wound on Karyne's stomach, a blister slanted across his skin. I can do a little. Burns are hard to heal, though. I can almost never do much more than relieve the pain. Rennis paused, then lowered her voice further and glanced down at her own arm. Can you heal burn scars? The smooth, tanned skin of the woman's left shoulder was marred with thick, raised lines. Naj's brand of 2 crossed swords. Chesavia swallowed down the revulsion the mark raised, but she shook her head. A scar is not a wound. There's nothing to heal. The body isn't fighting it. Rennis kept her focus on Karyne's stomach. How long ago did Naj make you his wife? Chesavia asked. Rennis didn't look at her brand. 4 years ago. What sort of brands do wives receive in Queensland? Chesavia cast out. Karyne's body lit up, brighter than yesterday, without the gaping darkness in his gut any longer. Rennis lit up beside her. 2 guards positioned directly outside the door, well within hearing range, flared into light as well. The one on the left was the size and demeanor of Fran, who'd become Chesavia's personal shadow. He hadn't objected earlier when she'd told Rennis of Queensland. The vast forests, the Rocky Mountain Range to the west, the snow-capped peaks to the north, the sprawling city of Queenstown with its stone palace. But when Chesavia had asked Rennis if she ever dreamed of leaving the moors, he'd stepped in and demanded they work more and talk less. Women, Chesavia said quietly, aren't branded in Queensland, nor in coastal Balon, nor in Napan, unless they are slaves. Rennis's hands stilled in the soapy water where she scrubbed bandages. She looked over her shoulder. But you are marked. She nodded to the tattoo on the back of Chesavia's wrist. This isn't the mark of any bond. Chisavia pulled the bandage off Karyne's wound. It was heavy with pus and blood, and she dropped it into the cloudy water where the other dirty cloths soaked. It's a quote that I don't want to forget. What does it say? Chisavia held out her wrist and traced the runes. The day is shaped not by the violence of the storm, but by the fall of the light and the voice of the rain. Rennis let out a short laugh. I see why you had to write it down to remember it. It makes no sense. It means that the hardest part of the day doesn't have to define it. Chisavia stood and moved toward the door, holding her hand out until the evening light soaked into it. Warmth rolled up her arm, rippling through her chest and up the back of her neck, burning away the exhaustion of the day. She stretched her fingers out, feeling the play of the light across each one. It pushed away the smothering closeness of Fran's looming presence and the pressure of the clan surrounding her. I'm always tempted to let the difficulties around me shape my life. But the storm is only a part of it. Even a stormy day holds so much more. Life-giving light, or the pattering sound of the rain. Rennis turned back to her washing. That's a nice thing to say, she said quietly, but nearly impossible to actually do. Chisavia dropped her hand and moved back to Karyne's side, bringing a new clean bandage. Thus the need for the tattoo. She cast out into the young man one last time. Today went well. His deep wounds are healed. I'll work again tomorrow, but it should be easier than today. It will take a long time for him to fully regain his strength, but the worst is over. Something blocked the sunlight in the doorway, and she turned to see Fran striding toward the young man. Show me, he ordered. Chisavia pulled back the new bandage. Don't touch him with your dirty hands, she said as he reached for the wound. His jaw clenched in anger, but she held up her hand. Unless you want to add a new infection to the wound I've worked so hard to clean. Karyne's wound was still an ugly tear across his skin, but the hot red lines that had snaked away from it were gone. The swelling had disappeared, and his face had lost the pinched, pained expression. Fran stared at the young man for a moment, then turned away. Come, he ordered, but the word held less bite than normal. Chisavia stifled a sigh. I just need a moment of rest in the last light of the day. Fran stepped at the doorway and gestured up over the tents. Naj Tak has set dinner in such a place. Chisavia stepped up next to the huge man. On a hillside just past the edge of the encampment, Naj sat reclined, illuminated in the setting sun. That will be perfect. She turned to Rennis. Give Karyne more of the sleeping draught soon. I'd like him to sleep until dawn. She followed Fran outside. Her legs grew heavy as she climbed up in the shadows that already sat on the side of the hill. Fran stopped near the top, motioning her to continue, and she did, trudging uphill until she stepped into the streams of evening light. They sank into her face and arms, and she stumbled to a stop, closing her eyes and drinking them in. Most people appreciate a sunset with their eyes open. She opened hers to see Naj reading a book on a wide woven blanket. A low table filled the center of it, set with dinner. He reclined on a pile of cushions embroidered with the signature reds and golds of the clan. His sword belt was off again, but lying within reach at the side of the table. I appreciate the beauty of it, she said, sinking down on the other set of cushions with a groan of relief. But maybe not as much as I love the feel of it. Did you come up here to admire the sunset? He turned toward the setting sun, nodding. It's rare that our wind stills like this. I wanted to enjoy the opportunity. The sun sat on the western horizon, and she shifted her arms until as much of her skin as possible tingled with its light. Your son is doing well. The deep infection has been cleaned, and the most serious tears healed. Another day should allow me to accomplish everything I can. Then he just needs a long period to regain his strength. Naj closed the book and set it on the corner of the table, his face unsurprised. But I assume you know all that, since you've been spying on us all day. Monitoring the health of my son, he corrected her, not spying. He handed her a glass of wine. And I am very pleased with what you've done. He picked up his own glass and tipped it toward a small wooden box in the center of the table. A token of my appreciation. The unnerving possessiveness of last night's conversation was gone. If she didn't look at the encampment of mountain warriors at the base of the hill, she could almost imagine she sat across from some nobleman outside Queenstown. She picked up the box and opened the lid. Inside, nestled in crimson fabric, sat a silver ring hammered into the shape of a graceful crescent moon. The workmanship was stunning, and as she pulled it out of the box, the hammered dimples glittered in the sunlight. It's beautiful. From the heft of it, it was real silver. I don't want payment for anything I've... It is not payment. It is a gift. He watched her closely, holding up his hand where a gold ring sat, forged into the shape of a glowing sun. The moon is always honored by the sun, no matter where she moves in the sky. She was beginning to incline her head when he continued. And he can always reach her, no matter how far she roams. He stared at her with an unnerving intensity, a cross between hunger and admiration. Try it on. My silversmith can adjust it to fit. The sun sank behind the distant hills, and the warmth of its light faded from her skin. A flicker of blue flashed from Naj's sword, and a shiver of distrust rolled through her. She turned the ring over, but found no runes carved into it anywhere. She cast out, but the only thing that lit up was herself, Naj, and the unsettling swords. While her own rings shone with nodes of light from the vital they held, the silver moon ring was perfectly common. Do you not appreciate its beauty? He asked. She kept her eye on the ring. What exactly does this gift signify? My protection. A place of great honor in the strongest clan on the moors. Raising her gaze to him, she let her hand sink down onto the table. You're asking me to be your 12th wife? His expression gained a dangerous glint. My most honored wife. Together, you and I will rule this whole land. He leaned closer. I think I could use a little feminine magic on my side. The thought of the brand on Rennis's shoulder made Chesavia shift her arm, and she looked back at the ring, hoping he couldn't see her revulsion and searching for a way to decline. She cast out again at the swords. If she told him she was entertaining the idea of accepting him, could she get close to the swords? To destroy them if she could, or at least steal them away? The idea was implausible at best. Her wave rolled down the hill. Fran's shape lit up partway down the front side, along with several other sentries spread out in a line. On the back side, though, Naj's guards were clumped together, moving quickly up the slope. Chesavia glanced in their direction, curious to know why they were approaching. Then, the very end of her fading wave rolled over 3 more bodies lying still on the ground behind them, their vital spilling out onto the ground. She scrambled to her feet. Naj! 4 men charged over the crest of the hill, weapons drawn. Naj dove for his swords and lunged to his feet. Run! Chesavia stumbled back from the attacking men. Their sleeves under their leather vests were mottled with greens and blues, and they rushed at Naj as a group. Naj held his black sword in his right hand. The darkness around it was like a sliver of midnight sky. A rough hand grabbed Chasavia's arm, and she spun to find Fron. "Stay behind me!" He took up a position in front of her, his long, wickedly curved sword drawn, but he made no move to help his chief. The other sentries rushed to the top of the hill as Naj swung the black sword in a vicious arc. It sliced into the first attacker. The man cried out in pain, and the shadows surrounding the sword shot out like claws, tearing into him, digging deeper and deeper into his body. His cry turned into a scream of pain, a ripping, terrified sound that cut through the dusky moors. Chisavia cast out in time to see the light of the man's body siphoned out of him, and into the sword. In a breath, his life guttered out, and he collapsed to the ground. His vital surged into Naj, brightening him and flaring the blue sword into blindingly bright light. It lit the brutal angles of Naj's face as he drove it into the next man like a knife into butter. With astounding speed, Naj set upon the last two, parrying their thrusts as though they were children. His blue sword stabbed through the heart of one, then he spun and slammed the hilt into the temple of the other. The man went flying as though he'd been kicked by a horse. He landed, unmoving. Naj strode up to him, raised his sword, and plunged it into his chest. The Montan sentries raced down the far side of the hill, searching for more attackers, but Naj stayed bent over the dead man, the flickering blue light of his sword casting his face into an inhuman mask. The black sword hung from his other hand, unused since the first blow. The shadows still roiled around it, but they were fading slightly. "Take her to her quarters," he said, without looking over, his voice low and rough. Fron grabbed Chasavia's shoulder. "Come." In the quiet of Karn's chamber, Chasavia sat on the bedroll and held her quill and journal in shaking hands. There is no demon, but the swords are perhaps worse. The black one steals the vital from a person, then feeds the wielder and the blue sword until they have inhuman strength and speed. I cannot leave the weapons here, not with him, not with any of the warriors here who are already so hungry for blood. And yet this place is closing in around me. I desperately want to escape. Tomorrow, while there is sunlight, I will find an opportunity to get close to the swords. I will destroy them if I can, or at least steal them away. The plan sounds weak, even to me, but I must try. And then, I hope I can flee. I hope you enjoyed listening to The Shadowed Blade Part 1 by J.A. Andrews, narrated by Karyne Norton. Make sure to come back next week to hear Part 2. If you want to read more by Janice, go to jaandrews.com to find more of her books. This story about Chisavia takes place in the same world as all her books. She currently has 3 trilogies, all in that world, but I'll have a link to her series, The Keeper Chronicles, which is the best way to start immersing yourself in the world of the Keepers. To celebrate the podcast being back for Season 3, we're doing another giveaway this month, with a 3-month Audible subscription and 4 amazing summer fantasy audiobooks. So if you want a chance to win, go to findingfantasyreads.com/giveaway to enter. As always, I will have links for all those sites in the show notes. Thank you all for listening, and happy reading.